Hello, everyone. I believe we are live. Hi, everyone. I'm Jay Reckward. I am a author of epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, and urban fantasy, and I'm sitting in for Oliver tonight. Of course, we're here to discuss the great New Edge Sword and Sorcery Backer Kit campaign that's being sponsored by Brackenberry Books, and we're here to talk to one of the authors of one of the four novellas featured in that Backer Kit campaign, June Orchid Parker, who is of course, the author of Suplex and Sorcery. June, how are you doing tonight?
So far, so good. How are you?
Excellent. It's really fantastic to have you here, and I have to say, I was telling you before we got started, I've been reading the book, and it's fantastic.
Well, it's nice to be here, and I appreciate the compliment. Hopefully, there are many others who will enjoy the book the same way when it's out.
Well, I'm certain they will. It really is a great novella. Let's get started. I have some questions for you. Um, of course, it's like I said beforehand. It's wonderful to meet and talk with you about your new novella coming out. Um, you've been featured or mentioned on the live stream before, but briefly, could you reintroduce yourself? Tell us about how you came to write Sword and Sorcery, and more importantly, became involved in this tremendous crowdfunding campaign with Oliver and Company, which is now successfully over 80% funded.
So, up to this point, I have authored 3 short stories for New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, with the third coming out later this year, probably. I originally started writing SNS back in my late teens, actually. Like, I had read a lot of Conan the Barbarian, some Red Sonja comics, a little Elric, and eventually I hit a point where I was like, this is the kind of thing I want to write. So that was basically where I started, and I spent a lot of time developing my craft and et cetera, et cetera. And well, now I'm here with this novella that's coming out the gate next year. Oliver commissioned me to write Suplex and Sorcery back in October, and I delivered the first draft of that back in May. He was very interested in some of the ideas I'd been kicking around in the Nest Discord for a while, and he finally was like, I want you to write this for me. So I did.
Fantastic. So you've previously mentioned that you've written some stories that have appeared in New Edge Sword and Sorcery. I'm actually a big fan of your work. My exposure to you was in New Edge #2 with How Many Deaths Till Vengeance, which I have to say is a fantastic short story. Everyone should go check out. However, Suplex and Sorcery is not only a brand new story, but a real achievement because you obviously have this tremendous voice and skill in being able to blend the structure and characteristics of sword and sorcery with the aesthetics of another genre that's a favorite of mine and likely yours too, which is pro wrestling. How do you think you've grown as a fiction author between How Many Deaths Till Vengeance and this new novella, Suplex and Sorcery?
So it's been about 2 years since How Many Deaths was picked up for publication, and while I can't say I've necessarily made, leaps and bounds as an author since then, I have spent some time kind of, I guess, shedding inhibitions and learning to just kind of take risks and do what I really want and so forth. And that's kind of how we've ended up with Suplex now, is just having this willingness to go, well, I don't have to play it really safe anymore with the kinds of stories I want to tell. I can just do what I want, and presumably someone somewhere will want to read it. So a lot of that is, I guess that's basically the core development, is just kind of learning to, take a few more risks, kind of be somewhat more, I guess, critical, but not damningly critical of my own work, and just being willing to do something a little different outside of my own boxes, basically.
Can you give us an example of that, or maybe an example of how you develop that process of being able to let go and creatively let loose?
So part of that, when you compare How Many Deaths with Suplex, well, How Many Deaths is, this very intense and in some ways more traditional kind of sword and sorcery story. Whereas by the time you get to Suplex, obviously there's this fusion of genres, this very explicit fusion, and a very different kind of tone as well. Like, for example, well, How Many Deaths, again, very, very serious, very grim, kind of taking on these serious real world issues. And you get to Suplex, and well, the real world issues are there, but it's not premeditated, basically. Like, a lot of it was just kind of letting things grow out of these ridiculous kind of humorous situations, basically.
Right. I have to ask you about the main character. Is it pronounced Verica or Verica?
I pronounce it Varika, but as long as I
Varica.
understand you, we're all good.
Okay, excellent. She has this tremendous voice and presence, or the character has this tremendous voice and presence. Where did you come up with this character? Because, like I said earlier, I've been reading this novella and it's fantastic. And one of the reasons it's so fantastic is because we have this main character's point of view and it is so strong. Just if you could dig in for a moment for the audience, what are their origins? Where did they come from? How did they birth in your mind?
So Varika was kind of built piece by piece. Like when I was really getting back into wrestling like 2 years ago, this was a time when, for example, Rhea Ripley had gotten really, really popular even outside of wrestling. And
Yes.
so that's one of the main components is just having this, muscular wrestling woman that you can kind of look at and go, this is kind of like a fantasy character, kind of looks in some way like this larger than life fantasy type of character. And kind of building on top of that, like, you'll see as you go through the reading of Suplex, you'll see there are elements of Conan the Barbarian. If
Hmm.
you're into AEW, you'll see she's kind of taking after timeless Tony Storm to some extent. So
I
I would
got
say,
excited, everyone.
yeah, there you go. Be excited.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was this very kind of piece by piece kind of building of the character. She was not really formed wholesale, but she's kind of sprang out of these inspirations that would come and go, basically.
So, kind of moving away from Sword and Sorcery and Suplex and Sorcery for a moment. You mentioned Rhea Ripley, you mentioned AEW. It's very obvious we're both big pro wrestling fans. Um, what do you think right now of the product? I mean, we were talking earlier before we went live about some of the things that we watch, but if you take a look right now in terms of being a wrestling fan, how do you feel about the industry? The quote unquote craft of wrestling. As a fan, how are you feeling these days about it?
I think there are definitely reasons for optimism. Like you can find wrestling just about anywhere in the world you care to look, and you can find it in all these various styles. There's the WWE style, there's the AEW style, which is a little more breakneck paced. Of course, you can look at the Japanese promotions as well, where some truly interesting and sometimes outrageous things are happening, like, people wrestling in giant panda costumes.
Hmm.
And even in countries like China, Uganda, and others, there's wrestling there as well. So, I mean, there are plenty of places to look and plenty of wrestling promotions you could potentially support. So overall, like, I do feel pretty good about wrestling overall, and it's not just about like the two big corporation promotions or whatever. There's something for everyone out there on a greater or lesser scale.
You mentioned AEW, and I think we just passed the 5-year anniversary not too long ago. Um, as a wrestling fan, what do you think of AEW and what they've done in the 5 years that they've been able to be on the scene and kind of change the business, so to speak?
Well, they've done some pretty incredible things. I am sort of a latecomer to watching AEW, I guess you could say full time. Like, I started making appointment viewing of it, like, even just earlier this year. But looking at, some of the legacy wrestlers they've had on, like Sting and Dustin Rhodes and so forth, and, being able to kind of get better wages for wrestlers across the board, even outside of AEW and so forth. I think what they do there is really important. And I think these 5 years have kind of borne out the importance of their existence by and large.
Right. You mentioned Rhea Ripley and her being an inspiration for Verica, the main character of Suplex and Sorcery. It's very obvious, I think, to any wrestling fan out there and to all the Sword and Sorcery fans who may be listening and wondering who are we talking about. Um, Rhea Ripley is this gigantic star who kind of mixes the muscle mommy motif with um, black leather goth, and she presents this very kind of extreme character that's really captured the audience. What about her goes into Varika, or is there any cross pollination between the two, so to speak?
Well, I would say Rhea Ripley was kind of the base for the character, but I built a lot on top of that. So just having, this muscular, kind of heroic woman as she is nowadays, kind of at the
Mm-hmm.
forefront of basically the entire wrestling scene, just about. I think that's, in many ways, that's something to celebrate, really. And it's hard to deny this kind of impact she's had on the industry and, the impact on the fans, the people who really admire her, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, she's kind of just incredible and kind of, in some ways, a very obvious source of inspiration for the kinds of characters that I write, especially Varika.
You mentioned, and I promise for everyone listening, we will move on to wrestling after, move away from wrestling after this question. Um, you mentioned Tony Storm, who, right now, I will just say this for myself, is my favorite wrestler going right now. Um, just this brilliant character. Do you have any thoughts on Tony and how she might have influenced Suplex and Sorcery, or just general thoughts, because she is such an amazing performer now that really is kind of lighting up the fans' imaginations?
Yeah, Tony is just this really captivating and really funny personality. And because I wanted Suplex and Sorcery to be, basically this funny kind of novella, I looked at a lot of what she was doing. And, she's kind of, in some ways, this boisterous character, even though she's also, mimicking like these movie stars of the early 20th century, basically, like, 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. So that was her character was definitely one that I've felt some inclination to kind of, I guess you could say, borrow from, even just
Mm-hmm.
like broadly speaking, just someone who is, again, larger than life, I guess you could say.
I have to note one thing about Suplex and Sorcery, and this kind of ties back to Tony Storm in a way, but getting to Varika's voice. Varika has such a pronounced, clear voice in the novella, and there's such good world building. When you're putting together Sword and Sorcery and you're having to work with different elements like pro wrestling, but also humor, what kind of work did you have to go into striking those different sorts of balances?
That is a good question. And partly it's difficult to answer because it seemed to come more or less naturally. I guess in the interest of full disclosure, even though I was commissioned to write the book in October, I pretty much wrote the thing almost entirely in 2 months from like March till May. So there was not necessarily a lot of time to like just sit and think about
Mm-hmm.
what I was going to do necessarily. It kind of just had to happen. So there's this kind of spontaneous element involved. And so that does admittedly make the question a little difficult to answer. It's really just however I was feeling at the time was kind of what went into the work.
When you think about Suplex and Sorcery, what sort of themes do you think arise, or will at least arise for the reader when they finally get their hands on this novella in 2026?
So, while the more serious elements of Suplex were, again, not premeditated compared to the Astartha stories I write, you will find that, there are reflections on, for example, the way pro wrestling has treated women in the past and even in the present.
Mm-hmm.
You might find some reflections on the role of, well, I guess just the role of money in wrestling. I was going to say the role of capitalism, but Suplex does not have a capitalist society. I mean, it's basically still, a monetary society with power structures and so forth, but it's more modeled on, ancient Greece and Rome and so forth. So those are a couple examples of the kinds of themes you might see as you're getting into Suplex, basically.
Did you feel like you had to strike a balance? Because one thing I notice in the text of Suplex and Sorcery is that even though I think a pro wrestling fan could read the story and recognize a lot of the things, you don't have, the terminology of heels or baby faces or kayfabe, or you kind of mentioned like the finishes to certain things and stuff like that. But there's this really kind of wide open, I guess, welcome to fans who may not know what pro wrestling is. What kind of considerations did you make in terms of, I guess, incorporating pro wrestling into the world building itself?
So part of it is like the framing device of the book is basically Vara is having this letter composed to her people back home, the Nemavians. And so the Nemavians, you can probably imagine this kind of maybe stereotypical barbarian type of society on the fringes of civilization or whatever. So naturally, they're not going to be familiar with pro wrestling that much either. So having Varika, kind of stop and explain some of these things that are going on in, this new home she's made and this new profession she's in, that's became basically an intrinsic part of writing the story the way that I did.
Right. One thing that is very difficult, I think, to translate into prose is combat. And pro wrestling in itself is not exactly combat. There's a large part of it that's performance. What sort of challenges and solutions did you face and come up with when it came to translating the in-ring action into sword and sorcery action, so to speak?
So one of the advisories I got from my editor, Oliver, was do not just do like scene by scene or blow by blow kinds of wrestling scenes, just hit the highlights basically. And so when you strip things down to, the highlights, the big blows or the things that kind of change the tide of the match or whatever, then it became a lot easier to just kind of focus on those. And if there's smaller stuff happening in between, you just kind of let that be like the connective tissue of a sentence or two. It wasn't too different from how I wrote the combat scenes in the Astartha stories, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, these are wrestling scenes and they are not entirely life or death anyway, but there's still a similar kind of structure going into them, basically.
What kind of background or what kind of research do you put into writing your combat scenes, if I may ask?
Well, this can be a little hit or miss because sometimes writing combat is not actually my favorite thing. So, in the case of Suplex, like I did want to learn how certain moves were done. For example, the suplexes and
Right.
that sort of thing. So, I went and watched some videos, read some descriptions online of how the moves are done, etc. And I did try to bring at least some of those into this story.
Very cool. So you've already mentioned some of the advice Oliver gave you in terms of editing Suplex and Sorceries. Tell us about working with Oliver and Brackenberry Books. What has the editorial process been like for the novella? And what sort of things surprised you in the lead up to completing Suplex and Sorcery?
So I don't know if I should say this, but up to this point, Suplex has not really had an editing process yet. What I submitted in May was like not entirely a first draft because I did go back and change some things before I submitted it, but it was pretty close to a first draft what I submitted in May, and currently still waiting on some notes from Oliver. I'm told that the edits to the novella will not be really extensive at this point. There'll be some, but like the fundamental structure of the book and so forth will not really be that different. Like comparing the arc to probably the finished product, you might notice some things are rearranged or condensed or rephrased, that sort of thing. But I don't expect the edits will be really tremendous either. So I guess maybe one thing worth doing is kind of talking about the phases of editing here. So typically you begin with a developmental edit, which looks at the basically the problems in the structure of the story and so forth, character motivations, particular scenes, pacing, etc., etc. So you go through that, and then after that, there is a copy editing phase where, fixing grammar and typos, maybe fixing smaller logic errors, etc., etc. And then you get that done, you submit that, and eventually you get paid.
Right. The most important part.
It's true.
This may be a personal or awkward question because I know he's listening. But what's it like working with Oliver as an editor. I got to talk to David C. Smith about it, and he had a lot of wonderful things to say. But I'm just curious about your take on it.
He is very pleasant. Yeah, he usually guides with kind of a gentle hand. Like he's not afraid to, point out problems or issues or whatever, but he'll do it in a way where things are phrased pretty nicely, and he gets you basically on board with what he wants, really. Which isn't to say you have to do what he wants, but he makes a pretty good argument for what he does want, basically. Yeah, I've been working with him for 2 years now, and can't really say I have any complaints. So if you happen to hire Oliver as an editor or end up with him as an editor or so forth, you're in good hands, I think.
That's fantastic. So stepping back from wrestling and suplex and sorcery and kind of your writing process and the editorial, I want to get your view on just the sword and sorcery scene as a whole right now. Ever since New Edge came out, it's done a lot to help push diversity on the scene. But there's also so many great new markets out there, from Old Moon Quarterly. I believe Battleborn's coming out soon. Uh, of course, Sword and Sorcery Magazine is doing their own backer kit campaign right now. But there's also a lot of great novels. There's a lot of great novellas coming out. There always seems to be a new anthology that's trying to get submissions. But just in general, how do you feel about Sword and Sorcery as a scene right now, and where it's been, where it's going? Just your general thoughts.
Well, in some ways, the sword and sorcery scene today kind of mirrors the wrestling scene in some ways. You can have it in basically any flavor you want. So, if you like what Ness is offering, you read Ness. If you like what another magazine or publication is offering, you read that. And yeah, there's just about something for everyone as long as you like SNS in the first place. And maybe even if you don't, you might be persuaded to try to get into it now and see if there's anything you do like. I guess I don't really have a deeper analysis of it right now, but just in terms of that general overview, like there's definitely something for you out there as long as you kind of know where to look.
Has there been anyone in SNS recently that you've read or that you've enjoyed in terms of their work?
Well, pretty much all the Ness authors, of course. I
Yeah.
did recently read Gail Simone's Red Sonja Consumed, which I felt was very good. That's a very compelling kind of story with strong characters. And of course, that's probably one of the more mainstream examples we have of SNS right now. I do still have a bit of reading ahead of me when it comes to some of the other magazines that dabble in SNS or adjacent things, like Old Moon Quarterly, for example, Sword and Sorcery Magazine, which you had mentioned there. I still have to dig into a little bit. But overall, I can see that the scene is thriving and that it's still moving forward. We're finding new ways to kind of innovate, I guess, and capture new audiences. And I can't be upset about that. That's for sure.
Right. You mentioned Conan, being one of those one of those characters from Robert E. Howard that got you into sword and sorcery in the past. Who are your favorite authors? Who are your influences? Maybe within sword and sorcery, but also maybe outside of them. If you could take us down a little bit of an exploratory path in terms of what makes June right.
Yeah, so I mean, as far as authors go, Robert E. Howard, for all of his, faults and so forth, is still one of my favorites because he had this very impactful kind of energetic, kinetic writing style, and I still look to his style at least for kind of some guidance on how I want to do things. Really, outside of SNS, I guess one example I could cite is actually Seth Dickinson, who writes the Masquerade series,
Mm,
beginning with the traitor Baru Cormorant. Now, this is a kind of a more cerebral, maybe darker kind of fantasy story. I don't know if you would call it an epic necessarily, although there is a lot of traveling around the world and meeting new peoples and so forth. But that is, I think, to me, one of the more captivating fantasy series in recent memory. And I do look forward to the fourth book whenever that comes out. I guess one thing with me in general is I'm not necessarily like a deep diver into authors' work so much. I mean, I
mhm.
will do that every now and then, but A lot of it is just kind of like the breadth of stuff that I read. So, for example, I read a book on astronomy earlier in the year, and last year I read, a book called The Death of WCW, which was one of the earlier
Fantastic
wrestling
book.
promotions. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an example of what I'm into, what I do for reading, etc.
So you mentioned Robert E. Howard and all of the problematic issues that might be ascribed to him. Being influenced by Howard and writing the diverse kind of fiction you do, how do you, as a sword and sorcery author, look at the problematic elements of Howard and not necessarily square them or excuse them, but how do you look at them in 2025? Is there a sense of author and artist? I'm sorry, art and artist. Is there a certain sense of separation? Do you put things in context of history? Just what is your general view of Howard in 2025?
I think a lot of it comes down to like discernment, I guess, and being able
Mm-hmm.
to say, I like what Howard was doing here. I am not a fan of what he was doing there, for example. Like, we know kind of all about his views on race and how difficult they could be at times. We also know some of his views on women and how he was able to temper those over time, perhaps culminating in his historical adventure, Sword Woman, which is actually one of my favorites by him. Um, so, with that, there is a certain social awareness that one probably should have before diving into these things or while diving into his works. And that hasn't steered me really too far wrong. I mean, I can appreciate the better aspects of his work while being able to say, well, this thing, that doesn't work for me, brother, etc.
Yeah, it doesn't work for me, brother. God,
Yeah.
yeah, it's been a few weeks.
Yeah, it
So,
has, hasn't it?
yeah, it feels like a lifetime. Um,
Right.
so kind of getting into that because you mentioned something about like Howard did kind of progress in terms of certain elements by the end of his career. Um, you mentioned Red Sonja as well, and you of course read Gail Simone's novel, which I actually found to be pretty good. I don't think it was the best thing in the world, but I thought like for a take on that character for the first time in a long time, it was really good. What draws you to Red Sonja, and do you think that the current presentation of the character is serving that character? And have you seen the movie yet, by the way?
I have seen the movie. It was incredibly mid, and I'm probably going to watch it 3 or 4 more times just to be sure.
Right.
um, as far as how the character is currently done, like in the comics and so forth, and the novel, I do like this direction for Red Sonja. Like,
Mhm.
um, I kind of like how abrasive she is in some ways, while in others, still having this kind of tender heart, like you see in the novel, for example, with some of the characters she gets involved with. Um, Sorry, you had a first question. Oh, yeah, sort of like what do I see in Red Sonja and so forth. And I guess before I knew exactly what I was, Red Sonja was one of those characters I looked at and thought, I kind of want to be like her. Maybe one of these days I'll just dye my hair red, find a chainmail bikini somewhere. Totally cis male though, right here. But she is this kind of, in some ways, she's an inspiring kind of icon, and I think getting into her now in like the 2010s, 2020s, etc. I think this is probably as good as the character has ever been, and probably as inspiring to me as the character has ever been.
Right. I I have not seen the movie yet. I have a press copy of it that I got on the sneak. I'm at the the thing that I hope for that movie. Can you at least tell me, is it fun? Like, is there parts of it that are fun?
It has its moments. I will definitely say that. Like, I would say particularly watch for like the main villain, and he's kind of ridiculous, but he's pretty enjoyable to watch.
Nice. Um, so one thing that I've wanted to ask about Suplex and Sorcery is the character of Cleon. Just a fantastic character. As where did Cleon come from?
Well, I figured the AWL, as it's called in the novella, the Athenaean Wrestling League, should have some sort of like overseer, manager type figure. And originally, I was not planning to do a Vince McMahon sort of character. I was kind of thinking more towards Tony Khan, but suffice to say, there was some developments in the writing of the novella where I was like, maybe this story would benefit from making him more of a Vince type character, which is not to say anything good about Vince. Let me make that clear, but just this is someone you can very, very much model a character on if you feel so inspired.
Right. Well, Vince is such a, we'll just say, particular character at this point in history.
Yep.
What do you think, and this gets back into wrestling, but also touches on the novella, what do you think makes a believable heel or villain? And what do you think has to be transmitted to a reader or someone in the audience for them to, I guess, kind of grab onto that villain?
They sort of have to believe in themselves to a greater or lesser extent. Like they have to believe that what they're doing is essentially correct. Maybe not morally correct, but correct by them anyway. Whether there's a monetary interest or something else there, just having some sort of motivation for this heel to latch onto and be like, this is what I want. You're not going to stand in my way. If you stand in my way, I'm going to bury you, and this sort of thing. So just having a sort of believable motivation involved and the conviction to see it through to the end, basically. That, to me, was kind of one of the driving things behind making a convincing heel out of, well, for example, the Sorcerer and his minions, as you'll see in the finished book.
Getting to the Sorcerer, is there any particular villains that go into the Sorcerer or any particular wrestling heels that go into the Sorcerer?
So this was kind of set off by checking out the feud between Sting and a guy called the Black Scorpion in WCW. I think this was around like 95, 96. Sting was still in his surfer era, and every so often this guy in like a black robe and like a balaclava would come out. He was called the Black Scorpion, and he would do this deep, kind of growly, intimidating voice at Sting and do weird magic tricks. Like, he'd put like an audience member in a cage, put a like a cloth over it, and then pull the cloth back and there's a leopard in the cage all of a sudden. And he's just doing this to try to get under Sting's skin. Well, the conclusion of that, it turned out the Black Scorpion was actually just Ric Flair the whole time, whom Sting had been feuding with anyway. So I don't know, I guess Ric Flair just felt like being really creative with this whole Black Scorpion gimmick, or really the bookers of WCW, the people actually responsible for the storyline, were just like, well, okay, it's just going to be Ric Flair. It's fine. We'll deal. We'll move on.
Right. It was Rick booking at the time? I forget.
I have no idea, to be honest.
Because I know there was like a 2 or 3 year period where he had the book, and it was chaos, to say the least.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, in terms of storylines, and for those Sword and Sorcery fans at home who don't know what wrestling necessarily is, there's this idea of something called booking, and that it's the idea of building a storyline between two characters that culminates in a match or an event or something like that. Sometimes a big event like WrestleMania, something like that. Were there any particular storylines or narratives from wrestling that directly influence Varika's story?
Other than the Sting and Black Scorpion storyline, I don't know, to be honest. I think that was kind of the main one that I took and just sort of ran with, transplanted into this setting where sorcery is real and so on and so forth, and just kind of built on top of that pretty much. Like I did say earlier, like you will see thematically there are things like, the treatment of women in wrestling, and you can probably point to specific times or segments or whatever from WWE, etc., where, the treatment of women was less than exemplary. But as far as specific examples go, I think that was pretty much the main one with Sting and the Black Scorpion.
do you have any particular favorite storylines from wrestling that kind of sit around in your head a little bit?
Every so often I reflect upon the AEW storyline involving Tony Storm and Mariah May, which is kind of a,
Fantastic.
yeah, basically became like a disaster lesbian story. There was a shoe, Tony Storm got stabbed in the forehead with this stiletto and, started bleeding all over the place. And, eventually they came to proper blows again and Tony won. Mariah is now in NXT as Blake Monroe.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a storyline that I tend to reflect upon every so often. And I guess, well, not even entirely a storyline, but like Sting's retirement run in AEW as well, and looking at some of the things he did there, like Sting at the time was approaching like 63, 64, and he did this tremendous dive off a ladder onto a table on the floor below, and that was one of those where it's just like, all right, the old man is getting out everything that he can before he retires. He's doing what he wants. I respect it.
Right. It probably. I'm curious to see what they do with John Cena towards the end of his run in December. But the way they gave Sting his send off was fantastic, and completely agree there.
Oh yeah, they really did right by him and by the fans there for sure.
Right. So kind of diverting from everything real quick. I've seen on your social media and heard through the grapevine / Oliver that you're a fan of kaiju. For a while now, there's been a growing fandom built off things like Pacific Rim, the enduring popularity of Godzilla, the inclusion of King Kong, and a reinvigoration in the space of huge monsters fighting it out, kind of like pro wrestling. What have you been enjoying when it comes to the kaiju genre, and would we ever see a sword and sorcery kaiju story from you somewhere in the future?
So as far as what I've been enjoying lately, I recently went and watched the first season of Monarch: Legacy of Monsters on Apple TV, and I think for those who maybe kind of missed the more grounded, realistic tone of Godzilla 2014, that is a good show to watch because they kind of throw back to that tone in some ways. I mean, there's still moments of, fun and silliness and so forth, but overall, I felt that show was really well done, and it kind of distinguishes itself from a lot of the later MonsterVerse films, which are basically pure entertainment, like Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. I mean, pure entertainment. I dug the hell out of it, in spite of, again, its noticeable flaws, basically. As far as would I do a Kaiju SNS story, I've been thinking about it, and I feel that I can at least pull elements from Kaiju into some of the stories that I have been doing. But as far as just doing like a straight up, like, here's your SNS character, here's the Kaiju they meet, and so forth, it hasn't been easy to come up with a really solid idea there. So I'm kind of still letting things percolate and just seeing what comes to mind, basically. It could happen one day. It's just not an immediate plan.
Right. Just kind of continuing on kaiju for a moment. So you mentioned Kong, and maybe this is where you can educate me because you're a bigger kaiju fan than I am. Was there a point where when did Kong become is Kong a kaiju himself? Is he like considered part of this race of? Because I unfortunately, yeah, go on.
So this has been like a matter of debate for a very long time, and
right.
Sometimes the best answer you can get is like, it depends on the incarnation of Kong, because sometimes like when he's fighting Godzilla, he is large enough to qualify as a kaiju, like back in the 1962 King Kong versus Godzilla, and then more recently into the MonsterVerse films. But then of course you have all these other films in between or before, like 33 and 76 and so forth, and there has been, at least in the past, some spirited debate about that. But I think we can say pretty safely that Kong has been a kaiju, that he is basically the grandfather of kaiju, whether or not he was one to begin with, and he definitely has a place in that whole history.
What draws you to kaiju, if I may ask?
That is a very good question, and I think a lot of it is just, a good chunk of it is the spectacle. You can't go outside in the real world and just see, a 50-meter monster trundling along or whatever. But, you can watch a movie and, Godzilla's on this island or he's in Tokyo or whatever, and maybe he's battling another monster like Mothra or whoever. And, it's just this grand spectacle of two impossible creatures fighting basically on this grand scale, in the heart of a city, destroying buildings, et cetera, et cetera. I do think with Godzilla in particular, like one of the more underrated aspects is that a lot of those movies do have some sort of social commentary in them
Hmm.
or underlying them. Like, of course, the 1954 film was basically about atomic weapons and the devastation of Japan and so forth. But even into the 60s, you get, capitalists trying to exploit
Hmm.
Kong by, having him do commercials for a pharmaceutical company, or you get someone trying to auction off Mothra's egg or what have you. And there has been like this thematic undercurrents throughout the Godzilla series from its inception. And I think that's what kind of keeps it interesting, keeps it fresh in some way. This is a character you can do a lot with. And it's not just Godzilla either, you can do a lot with
Hmm.
Gamera, for example, or Kong, or whoever else you can think of.
I have been waiting for a Gedera movie because when you talk about a movie that could actually be anti-capitalism, I think Gedera is always the perfect example of like this is not what we should do. And
No,
there's all these
right. Do not
storylines of like,
proceed any further with this.
yeah, exactly. And I think you hit on some really important things. When it comes to, and you mentioned it earlier with Varika's story in Suplex and Sorcery, and it wasn't intentional. And you you mentioned that it wasn't intentional, but when it comes to kind of addressing the idea of capitalism, where do you think fiction fits in the 21st century in doing that? Because we've had all these 20th century books that address poverty, address wealth inequality, disparities. Where do you think that conversation in terms of fiction addressing capitalism and its failures is going in 2025 as an observer, just as an outside reader and an observer?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the fiction is reflecting a lot of like outside real life concerns about capitalism and, the direction we've gone in terms of addressing climate change and poverty and all this sort of thing. I don't know if I have any like particularly deep thoughts about it at this point, other than, yeah, it is definitely reflecting like the broader realities outside of fiction that we're dealing with. But fiction at the same time, is a good lens potentially you can kind of take a step back from reality as well and go, well, here's how things are going in maybe this fictional world or this fictional scenario or what have you. And maybe we can, if we get this kind of distance, maybe we can look at it a different way, or possibly even just the way that, confirms our biases or whatever. Fiction is a powerful tool that way. It's, as I said, it reflects a lot of real world concerns. It can shine a light on those concerns. It can maybe propose solutions if one is inclined to do that as an author.
Do you set out to try to propose solutions, or do you think, is the criticism that you may try to level sometimes intentional, or is it something that just for you kind of arises out of the work itself?
With Suplex, it very much arose out of the work. And although I did find, well, I basically proposed one or two potential solutions to the problems that Varika and other wrestlers encounter there, it was not premeditated in the way that the Astartha stories are, because, the
Hmm.
Astartha stories that you find in New Age Sword and Sorcery are very much concerned with trans issues and trying to address trans issues and propose
Hmm.
solutions to them and so forth. Not always successfully, not always like meaningfully structural solutions, but nonetheless solutions of a sort. So yeah, like I guess I do have an inclination towards using fiction as a way of proposing potential solutions, and whether or not those are agreeable, whether or not there's room for meaningful conversations there. Well, I guess ultimately a lot of that is up to the reader as well.
Excellent answer. I have a few more questions for you before we wrap up. Um, so with Astartha and Varika, should we expect more Astartha stories, and should we expect more Varka stories in the future, or is that still up in the air for you?
Yes to both, because I definitely have at least a couple more Astartha stories I would like to do. And as for Varka, yeah, I do have plans for at least one sequel. I'm sure there could be many others afterwards, but in terms of concrete plans, I'm kind of looking at Suplex 2 as it is and just kind of letting my mind wander, thinking about what I could do concretely, what kinds of new characters I could introduce, this sort of thing. So, in terms of the active development, there's nothing to worry about there.
I have to ask as a pro wrestling fan because you mentioned the idea of a suplex too. Is there any sort of match types that you want to try to incorporate into Sword and Sorcery
So,
that you may already haven't?
right. So for example, I was looking on Reddit one day and they had like clips of this sort of historical match where basically this wrestling ring was like suspended on a lake, basically, and
Yes,
the
yes,
wrestlers were on this lake trying to wrestle, and it was a bit of a disaster. There's You can probably go on like Instagram or YouTube and find more contemporary examples as well, but something like that. But maybe we can put it in like a coliseum and we can have sharks swimming around in this
yeah.
sort of thing. We could do something really outlandish like that potentially. So that's one example of maybe a different kind of match type that I would maybe want to look at doing.
It could 100% work. Did you ever see the WCW show where they had an entire pay-per-view that took place like they built the ring in the center of a pool, and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
everyone had to work around like the edge of the pool?
It was a very attractive setup that they had. How well it worked practically, debatable.
I mean, I just want to see Kevin Nash do cannonballs, so I was happy.
Fair
um,
enough. Yeah, that's perfect.
um, so one question that is always on, or that's always taking place now in conversations between authors and artists. And I noticed on your social media that you support a lot of artists and you share a lot of their art. You probably can guess where I'm going with this.
Mhm.
Uh, AI is definitely having an impact on every creative industry right now.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, I will turn it over to you briefly, but when you look at the impact that it's having, I guess the first question is, do you have hope? And if so, where do you see all this going? If you wanted to take any sort of guess.
Well, I do still see, this deep desire for human to human interaction. And so, as long as that desire exists at all, there will always be a place for human made art, human made literature, visual art, et cetera, et cetera. As for like the actual AI industry, I do not foresee it getting too much farther from here without, a massive bust, I guess, or the bubble bursting pretty much with potentially catastrophic consequences. But, wait and see. We'll watch this space. We'll find out what happens when it happens, I guess.
Do you think that we shake through the AI book bubble too, or do you think that that is something that we as authors are always going to have to be dealing with to a certain extent from now on?
I mean, definitely to a certain extent, but again, I do hope anyway that this desire for more direct human interaction will kind of win out. So even when there is a book between me and you, for example, I am still transmitting something of myself to you as a reader. And whether or not you appreciate that to a greater or less extent, I mean, I think you'll at least appreciate that it came from me, that I built this thing with my own hands and so forth. I wrote this thing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think at least as long as that baseline appreciation exists, we will still be able to do fairly well as writers and visual artists and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for the time being, we're also still going to have to contend with, the slot machines and their purveyors.
Right. One last question, and then we will wrap it up. What's the most fun you had in writing Suplex and Sorcery?
That is a very good question, and I'm going to say that while this is a mild spoiler, there is a scene involving a court. Like,
Yes.
the characters are in this kind of courtroom type of scene, and that to me was just like, I did not foresee this getting here, but I'm gonna commit to this. It's going to be a good time, and I hope the reader finds it a good time as well.
I am absolutely certain they will. I know what scene you're talking about, but the entire novella is so good, and I can't wait for people to read it. Like I said before we got started, I was about 3/4 of the way through before I hopped on here. It's a really fantastic book, and I hope people really check out Suplex and Sorcery. June, thank you so much for joining us on the live stream to talk about Suplex and Sorcery. Where can we find out more from you, or do you have a website we can check out?
So my main website right now is breadsonia.wordpress.com, and you can probably find that on my Blue Sky profile, which is breadsonia.bsky.social. Those are probably the places you'll find me most active publicly.
Fantastic.
And oh, sorry. Before we
No,
sign off, I guess I should thank everyone who's tuned in. I should thank you for the interview opportunity and everything, and thank Oliver and so forth. It's been a very nice time, and I look forward to doing something like this again one day.
absolutely, and it was fantastic to sit down and talk with you and meet with you, and I hope everyone goes and supports the backer kit campaign right now for these 4 novellas. They're now over 82% funded, if my math is correct. But I think people are in for a real treat when it comes to Suplex and Sorcery. June, thank you so much, and everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you all later, and please check out the backer kit campaign. June, have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Hope everyone has a good evening. And again, check out the backer kit. Check me out, I guess, if you want to. And we'll see you around somewhere.
See everyone. Swords together.
Swords together.